What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be letting you guys in on 10 secrets that Vegas is telling us about the 2025 fantasy football season. So I've pretty much dug into like all the betting lines for every fantasy relevant player, running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends, looking at like the season-long over-unders for receiving yards, rushing yards, touchdowns, passing yards, things like that. And while you can't treat the Vegas lines like gospel, like I'm not just going to go through and order my fantasy rankings directly off of the Vegas betting lines. They're obviously very sharp. You have some very smart people putting these lines out. There's a lot of money exchanging hands. So these lines are fairly accurate. And I do think from a fantasy perspective, it can kind of help you locate some blind spots. Maybe you realize you're too low on a player, could also bring you back down to earth on certain guys. So I'm going to start off with the running backs. And this first player is Bucky Irving. He's someone that I was already pretty in on. This just kind of stamped him as a really solid target for me. And according to his Vegas betting lines, he does just project really well from a rushing perspective. His over-under for rushing yards is 1,000, 7.5 rushing touchdowns. Also, keep in mind that when you're looking at these betting lines, there's some like injury risk baked in. So like 1,000 yards for a 17-game Bucky season seems like a low number, but there is that potential injury risk. So, just keep that in mind with these betting lines. But when you project out just like rushing production, from a points perspective, he's better than Chase Brown in that department. That was somewhat surprising to me. He's right in line with Christian McCaffrey just from a rushing perspective. And then he is within 5 points of Ashton Genty. Now, Bucky Irving didn't have any receiving props on DraftKings, but I think that's really where he could separate here, where he had a really strong receiving season last year. 47 receptions, 392 receiving yards. If he stays healthy, he's going to put together some really strong receiving numbers. And then it really just comes back to his last 6 games of last season, his last 6 healthy games. This was post-bye, where he really kind of emerged as the clear RB1. He handled a really solid workload, 17.8 carries per game, 3.8 targets, averaged over 100 rushing yards a game, was involved as a pass catcher, 3.3 receptions, nearly 35 receiving yards per game. And then that led to 20.9 PPR points per game, even without hitting in the touchdown department, like scoring under a touchdown a game in that 6-game stretch. Just from like a situation perspective, he has everything you'd want. This is likely going to be a top 10 offense. This is an elite offensive line once they get Christian Wirfs back. He's the clear-cut RB1. And so I didn't move Bucky up a ton, but I did actually swap him with Chase Brown. I was a little bit underwhelmed with the projections from Chase Brown, was already in on Bucky. I think maybe you could say like Chase Brown has the upside to be more of a workhorse, potentially like a better, higher scoring offense. But I think Bucky has a lot of upside there also. Plus, I just think from like a player perspective, I do just think Bucky's more proven, and I think he clears Chase Brown as a talent. Now, the next player, or I guess players that I wanted to talk about was Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. And like this offseason has been really interesting for Kenneth Walker because the start of the offseason, Kenneth Walker was getting these glowing reports about, his scheme fit with the new offensive coordinator, him getting involved as a pass catcher. Everything just seemed super positive, like this offense was going to run through Kenneth Walker. And then over the last week or so, especially the last few days, it's been very doomsday about Kenneth Walker. And now we're getting reports that like Charbonnet is really pushing him for the RB1 spot. Like he's this established guy in this backfield. This is going to be, closer to a 50-50 split than a lot of people are expecting. And it's funny because over the last couple of years, I have been very in on Zach Charbonnet. I've kind of seen this upside for him to potentially like break in, emerge as the number 1 option, or at least force a really solid committee. And now it seems like there's some upside that happens. But I do want to point out that Vegas is not buying into this. Zach Charbonnet's rushing line is down at 575. And to put that into perspective, you have Tyler Algier, who is like a clear-cut, locked-in handcuff running back. His betting line from a rushing perspective is only 25 yards lower at 550. And so Vegas isn't really buying into this hype. I'll also say that like there's been some health issues for Kenneth Walker, but he's been a full go in 3 straight practices. So with these recent reports, I have made some minor adjustments in my rankings, which you guys can get for free, by the way. The link will be in the description, just a Google sheet. You guys can download it. So I have moved Kenneth Walker down a little bit, but I still have him in like that 3-4 turn area. And then I have moved Charbonnet up, but I did just want to point out that like Vegas is not anticipating this to be a very, very close, like 50-50 split between these guys. They still kind of view Charbonnet as like the clear-cut number 2 option. And then I think this is like the last overall point I'm going to take away from the running back position. But I kind of had this tier in my rankings that included Tony Pollard, Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, and Isaiah Pacheco. And I do think these Vegas betting lines kind of help me situate and order this tier in a way that I feel better about than, I did prior to looking into these betting lines. And the one guy that really stands out within this tier is Tony Pollard, where his rushing line is all the way up there at 900. That is the same number as Chase Brown. That is better than Devon Achane, Amarion Hampton, Breece Hall, James Conner, all running backs that are going, potentially way ahead of Tony Pollard. And it's not like he's just this like pure early down back, no receiving upside. He's caught at least 39 passes in 4 straight seasons. So I bumped Tony Pollard up to the top of this tier. Then I kind of moved Pacheco, I think, to the bottom of this tier, where compared to the rest of these guys, he's not faring super well, where his rushing yard is like tied for the lowest with these guys at 725 with Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, but he's not getting the same respect in the touchdown department as David Montgomery. And then I don't think he's going to be anywhere near as productive as a pass catcher than Aaron Jones. And so I still think Pacheco has some upside, could be the clear RB1 in a very good offense, but just within this tier, I did bump him down to the bottom of it. And then DeAndre Swift is also someone who kind of stands out here, where an 800 rushing yard line is really solid, especially for a player who does have a lot of receiving upside. So, feel even a little bit better about DeAndre Swift than I did before digging into this information. Now let's talk about the wide receiver position. And I think the player that stood out the most to me was Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I had Amon-Ra pretty firmly in this tier with like the Malik Neighbors, Nico Collins, Brian Thomas Jr. You could throw, Puka Nacua in that tier over the last couple of weeks with like the Matthew Stafford uncertainty. But I had pretty clearly had him as like the second to last guy in that tier. I had him ahead of BTJ, but it was me always kind of flipping Neighbors and Collins at the top. And I didn't really put a ton of consideration to having Amon-Ra St. Brown, ahead of one or both of those guys. But you look at Vegas and he projects very well. You can kind of, translate to PPR points when you take the reception line, the receiving yardage line, and then the reception touchdown line. And Amon-Ra St. Brown comes out as the wide receiver 4, only trailing Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and CeeDee Lamb. So he does have Malik Neighbors like right on his tail, just 2 PPR points behind him, but has like a decent amount of distance, like 15-point difference between a Puka Nacua, a Brian Thomas Jr. What's that 25-point difference between him and Nico Collins from the Vegas projections? And so I'd always viewed Amon-Ra St. Brown as like a much safer pick than Neighbors, Collins, BTJ. He's a proven producer on a top offense, but I had kind of sided with the potential ceiling upside of a Nico Collins, even like a Malik Neighbors, where I think from a talent perspective, Neighbors is better. It's just his offensive situation is so poor. And so these projections definitely have opened me up to potentially moving Amon-Ra St. Brown like towards the top of this tier. Now, like I said earlier on, I'm not just going to like take these PPR point projections and just automatically pencil in Amon-Ra St. Brown to be my wide receiver 4. Even though Puka doesn't fare super well, I'm still going to lean towards Puka here. I think he's getting a little bit disrespected in the touchdown line, but it does make me rethink how I have Amon-Ra ranked relative to both Nico Collins and Malik Neighbors, where maybe I think like at a peak outcome, Neighbors and Nico both kind of outproduce Amon-Ra St. Brown. But I do think that safety matters for Amon-Ra, that floor. And it's not like he's like a low ceiling player. Like he's averaged over 20 PPR points per game. And so I'm still not firmly locked in on how I'm going to order those 3, but I certainly think it's more of a discussion in my mind, potentially putting him ahead of Neighbors and or Nico Collins. So definitely higher on Amon-Ra St. Brown after looking into this. Another player who I think projects like shockingly well is Drake London. When you once again take out like the PPR point number, he is the wide receiver 6 in points according to projections. That is ahead of Puka Nacua, BTJ, Nico Collins, guys who are pretty firmly being drafted like a tier or even 2 tiers ahead of him at the wide receiver position. And for me, one of the concerns with Drake London is that there is still some uncertainty here with Michael Penix, where yeah, Drake London had some solid games with Penix last year, but it's a small sample size. He is not proven to be a productive NFL quarterback. Vegas clearly doesn't seem to care here, and so I did end up bumping Drake London ahead of A.J. Brown. I do think without an injury to Saquon, like London does just have the much higher ceiling. And I'd also kind of previously viewed Lad McConkey and Drake London as similar bets. I am kind of willing to accept that there should be some distance here between these two after you compare the projections, where Drake London's coming in at like 243 points to Lad McConkey's 220. So did move up on Drake London, I think at least one spot, did bump him up ahead of A.J. Brown. And I think we have a couple more wide receivers here. The first one is going to be Jackson Smith-Njigba. He comes out as the wide receiver 11 in projected points, and then has the sixth highest reception line. Now, his overall, I guess, production, like the way he's getting to these fantasy points, is a little like PPR scammy, where every other wide receiver going ahead of him has like an 1,100 receiving yard baseline, whereas JSN is below 1,000 yards at 975. But like I said, his reception total's way up there. Vegas obviously isn't overly concerned about the touchdowns, where he still has like a 6.5 touchdown line that's better than Puka. That's the same as Nico Collins. Now, personally, I'm not fully buying in on that. Like, I do think Nico Collins should be scoring more touchdowns than JSN, but Vegas clearly likes him. I have moved JSN up. Now, I'm still going to be lower on him than consensus. I still kind of have the idea that in that third round area, I want to be targeting running backs, tight ends, and quarterbacks. I'm kind of fading that wide receiver position once you're getting into like the JSNs, the Garrett Wilsons, guys like that. So I have moved him up a couple of spots. Believe he is now my wide receiver 16. Have him as like an early fourth round pick. I bumped him ahead of Mike Evans, Garrett Wilson, guys who I also don't think have the highest ceilings, but also don't project as well as a guy like JSN, according to Vegas. And then the final wide receiver I'm going to talk about in this video is going to be DJ Moore, and he is someone who I have been fading pretty much throughout the entire offseason. And admittedly, he's probably still going to be like a slight fade for me heading into fantasy drafts. But Vegas does really like him, where he is projected to be the wide receiver 15. And you look at his overall lines, like very similar projections to T. Higgins. His reception line is at 80.5. T. Higgins, 4 lower at 76.5. They have the same receiving yardage total at 975. And then T. Higgins, projected for one more touchdown. But they're in a very similar range. You have T. Higgins going like early to mid round 3, whereas DJ Moore going round 4, potentially round 5. Now, I'm not expecting him to produce in the same range as T. Higgins personally. I still am kind of preferring the cheaper Bears weapons, where if I'm buying into this offense, I want it to be Rome Odunze, Colston Loveland, Luther Burden, but I have moved him like more in line with consensus, where he is now my wide receiver 25. So he's no longer a strong fade for me. Vegas really likes him. And I do think this is a situation where I could like come back after the season and just realized I overthought things, where it's like, if I'm in on this offense, DJ Moore's clearly the most proven weapon. He's logged a fantasy wide receiver 1 season. Like, why was I fading that player? I do understand that that's possible. So I have moved myself more in line with consensus, and I'd be fine to get a DJ Moore, share on one of my redraft teams. Now let's pivot over to the tight end position. And I want to start off by talking about the tight end 1, and that is Brock Bowers. I have been very high on Brock Bowers. Obviously, he's been my tight end 1, but just from like an overall like player ranking perspective, I believe he is my 15th ranked player. So very in on him. And I do think the Vegas lines back that up, where he is the tight end 1 in projected points. His receiving yardage line is 100 yards higher than both Trey McBride and George Kittle. And then I also wanted to compare him to some of the wide receivers, just looking how he would stack up if he had a wide receiver designation compared to some of these other top studs. And he projects out pretty well. Like, he's right there in that T. Higgins range. You have Lad McConkey, who's going in the same round as him, round 2. And he's in that range where he's, his reception total is 85.5. Receiving yardage total is 1,000. That's better than JSN, Devontae Adams, T. Higgins, DJ Moore, Tyreek Hill in the screenshot. Where he does fall behind a little bit is just the touchdowns at 5.5. But you could totally see the upside here, where if he hits in the touchdown department, is able to get into the end zone 8-9 times, which I don't think is uncalled for, he could truly end up being like a top 6 option from like a wide receiver and tight end perspective, where he's producing up with some of the other wide receivers getting drafted in a very similar range. So I am very in on Brock Bowers this year, and I feel kind of vindicated after looking at those Vegas lines. Now I want to take a look at the tight ends kind of going outside the big three. So the big three would be Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, George Kittle. Very in on all three of those dudes. I think these projections, make me feel pretty good about that. But after those three, you can just see there's like not a ton of separation with these other tight ends, where like the tight end 4, the highest, receiving yardage total is 700. That's TJ Hawkinson, Travis Kelce. But then you have a lot of dudes that were within like 100 yards of that line, where you have Sam Laporta, you have Mark Andrews, you have David Njoku, you have Tucker Kraft. Even like right below that, you've got Colston Loveland, you've got Dalton Kincaid, Dallas Goedert. Like, you have a lot of guys in the mix. We know touchdowns can be pretty volatile year to year. This just kind of, reinforces my point that you don't want to be reaching for these mid-round tight ends, where I think sometimes it's just like the way people naturally think, where it's like the first 3 tight ends go off the board, you're getting into like early round 5, and it's like, wow, Laporta's the best guy available. There hasn't been a tight end picked in like a round and a half, 2 rounds. Is this the time where I pull the trigger? And I would just kind of push to avoid that line of thinking, where I just feel like taking Laporta in like round 5 with these projections, you'd be better off waiting a few rounds and getting a Mark Andrews, and then you get to Andrews, and it's like, I think you'd be better off waiting a few rounds and getting like a Colston Loveland or a Tucker Kraft, David Njoku. I just feel like you should kind of kick the can down the road. There's going to be one of these tight ends that kind of slips, and even if they don't, on most platforms, Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren are both really, really solid values. And rookies in general aren't going to be projected super well just because they are very volatile, where they could be nothing. They could also have, a ton of upside. And so I am willing to take that upside swing at the tight end position with those rookies. And then the final position we're going to talk about here at the quarterbacks. Want to start off by looking at the elite quarterbacks. That is Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Jaden Daniels. Now, before I looked into this, I did have Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen back to back, but I had pretty consistently throughout the offseason just favored Lamar Jackson. He had been my quarterback 1, hadn't really wavered there, even though I did have them back to back in my rankings. But after looking at this, where you take, the passing yardage line, passing touchdowns, the rushing yards, the rushing touchdowns, Josh Allen actually pretty clearly outprojects Lamar Jackson, where he comes in at 373 PPR points to Lamar's 356. And so I did just make the flip. They're still going to be back-to-back. But as of right now, I am favoring Josh Allen. It does seem like the big separator is like, even though Lamar is going to have more volume on the ground, from a yardage perspective, Josh Allen is probably going to kill him in the touchdowns, where he's projected for double digits, where Lamar is down at 4.5. And then I still feel good about the other 2 elite options, Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels, but I also feel pretty decent that I've had some sort of separation between those 2 blocks, where I've had, Lamar, Josh Allen back to back, then a little bit of space. Then I have Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels. I think the projections kind of show that that was probably the right call. And then just a couple of other quarterbacks that stood out here. Baker Mayfield is one where I have moved him up after taking a look at this when we're just looking at passing points. So taking the passing yards, the passing touchdowns, Baker comes in tied for 3rd in projected passing points, and he's just 2 projected points away from Patrick Mahomes, who is the quarterback 2. Joe Burrow pretty clearly is the number 1 option, but Baker Mayfield's right there in contention to be number 2 from these projections. And he's coming off a season with career best rushing production, where he rushed for 378 yards, 3 touchdowns. So now he's a quarterback who does have that elite passing upside, at least according to Vegas, while also having at least, a solid rushing number. You're going to have those truly elite mobile quarterbacks like the Lamar Jacksons, the Josh Allens, Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts. Baker Mayfield's never going to compete with those guys. But then you kind of have that next tier of guys that can hit 300 yards, a few touchdowns. I feel like that's like the Patrick Mahomes, the Trevor Lawrences, guys like that. And now that Baker has potentially entered that tier, I do think he's, a very solid quarterback pick. I still think he gets a little bit overdrafted on certain platforms where he's getting pushed into like round 6, round 7. I still don't think he has the rushing production to make like that big of a difference at the quarterback spot. But personally, in my rankings, I have moved him up to my quarterback 7. He has a solid group of weapons with Mike Evans, Really like Emeka Egbuka, Chris Godwin coming back at some point. You've also got Bucky Irving as a weapon out of the backfield, and then a very strong offensive line, especially once Tristan Wirfs is back. So do feel better about Baker Mayfield. And then Justin Fields, someone who I'm cooling off on a little bit. He had been like a real priority target for me earlier on in the offseason. A lot of the mock drafts I'm doing, if I'm waiting at quarterback, I'm snagging Justin Fields. And it's just tough to ignore how poorly he projects as a passer, where there are 26 quarterbacks on DraftKings who have passing yard and touchdown lines. And Justin Fields is like just so clearly the bottom of the barrel, where Aaron Rodgers and Jalen Hurts are tied for the lowest passing yardage line at like 3,200. Justin Fields is down at 2,550 from a passing touchdown number. You have Bryce Young at 18.5. Justin Fields is down at 14.5. So like just clearly behind the rest of these dudes. Now, he still does have good rushing production, projections where he's at 650 rushing yards, 6.5 touchdowns. To me, these passing lines are telling me that Vegas doesn't think he's going to be the quarterback for the full season, which would obviously suck. I'm still willing to draft Justin Fields, but I would no longer consider him to be like a real priority target for me. If he's going into double-digit rounds, I'll be totally fine to take him. But like I said, just not someone that I'm really prioritizing in my drafts anymore. And so that is going to wrap it up for these secrets that Vegas is telling us. I do think this can be a helpful exercise. Hopefully you felt like this video was valuable. If you enjoyed, hit the like button, subscribe. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.